Hi, my name is Nicole Herbert, and I am a teacher licensure student at UNC Asheville, pursuing my licensure in secondary, both middle and high school English language arts, grades 6 through 9 and 9 through 12. For the next few minutes, I will be discussing my Education 346 field experiences in the general education classroom. For my field observations, I observed Miss Keychuk, 8th grade English language arts and social studies courses at King Creek Middle School in Fairview, North Carolina. I in let's see. I observed a variety of Miss Keychuk's classes. I observed an inclusive and rather diverse social studies class that did not have uh, the added benefit of an inclusion specialist. I observed an inclusive English language arts class that did have the benefit of Miss Johnson, one of the inclusion specialists at King Creek's, presence in the classroom, and I also observed Miss Keychuk's AIG English language arts cluster class that had a very diverse mix of students. Some of those students were identified as being AIG. They had tested into AIG. Others were considered advanced students and so were placed in the cluster group. And some of those students, in spite of their advanced intellectual and academic abilities, also had some learning disability and other needs that required IEPs and 504 plans. So each of these classes were really diverse. I should also say that the inclusion class, which I'm not going to say too much about in this video because I really want to focus on the general education classes, the classes for which I did not observe the inclusion specialist. All three of these classes, but in particular the inclusion class, had a number of English language learners in the class, to varying degrees, their linguistic abilities to varying degrees. So, what were they studying? I observed Miss Keychuk students observing quite a few different topics. So when I first entered her social studies class, students were writing essays on what makes a fascist leader. And so they were studying World War II, and they were studying fascism in the context of World War II. I also observed I observed an activity that students did where they were studying U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and they had to read articles that debated whether or not the U.S.'s participation was well justified or poorly justified, whether the U.S. should have participated or should not have participated. I observed a lesson on post-war suburbanization, post-World War II, sort of the development of the suburbs in the U.S., and the sort of greater ramifications of that. I didn't quite see them go there, but that was the topic that they studied. And they did talk about some of the social implications, but not super in depth in my short time in the classroom. And so I saw a variety of different topics in the social studies classes. In the language arts classes, however, I really just observed the students working on a single project throughout the course of the entire 9 weeks. Really, I ended up being in and out of Miss Keychuk's classroom for the larger part of a 9-week grading period. So for that, in the language arts classes, both the AIG cluster and the inclusive class, students were really focused on communication and presentation strategies, right? They were engaged in this project that Miss Keychuk called Genius Hour. And so the students were given the opportunity to learn about any topic of their choosing. They had to develop a research question. around which they focused their research, and then they had to decide what presentation modality was the most appropriate for conveying what they learned in response to their research question to their audience. So a very sophisticated project that the students worked on over the course of 9 weeks. They had to get both the approval of the teacher, their parents, and then the student, of course, had to sign an agreement for the project. And they were given pretty much free range in terms of what they did. Some students, let's see, some of their topics ranged from safe swimming to history of gun laws to the development of the automobile to what sort of educational and professional requirements there were for various careers. And some of those careers included becoming a hairstylist or beautician. I saw another student who was interested in becoming a psychotherapist, and so she did a research project in which she presented the educational pathways to earn a professional counseling degree. I would definitely characterize and describe Ms. Keychuk's teaching strategies as very project-based. Not a whole lot of direct instruction in her classrooms, period, like across the board in either the social studies or the language arts classes. Class started at the beginning of each day. She spent the first 5 to 10 minutes explaining to students what their task or project was for the day, and then she let them go. Right? And then they worked on the project, they had the instructions, they had the materials that they needed, and they just got to work. Her classroom was designed so that each of the students, so that the room was arranged in these little clusters of desks, so 4 to 5 desks in a cluster, the desks facing each other, and and the clusters having some space between each other. Throughout the classroom. So a very collaborative classroom. It was never quiet in her room. Students were in constant communication with each other, and one might think that they would be off task most of the time. But I was really surprised to find that, in fact, very many of the conversations were directly related to what students were learning, right? Because they were given a problem that they had to solve. So, for example, you have this article that is about, that is an opinion piece on U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. And you have to read this article, your group has to read this article, and you guys have to determine what the position of this article is. Do they have any bias? Where are they coming from? A lot of these kind of language arts skills that are really critical and necessary to the study of history and in sociology and social studies. So a lot of work, a lot of collaborative work, right? And Miss Keychuk really just she really takes the back seat and she just circulates her classroom. She doesn't really get on to students. She doesn't consistently check in. She's not always listening into groups or always working with them or making sure they're on task. She just lets them go. They know what's expected of them, and she sets them up to do that. The material, oftentimes in the beginning she gives this 5 to 10 minute presentation of what it is they are going to be working on for the day, what their learning objectives are, and what kind of products they should be producing. And then during that time she'll give them the materials that they need. So for an example, with the Genius Hour, I have a worksheet here, and I'm hoping it'll maybe appear. Yeah. So with the project interview, I asked her about her teaching philosophy and her teaching methods, and she said that she was really invested in helping students develop 21st century skills, right? So in the 21st century, we need problem solvers and critical thinkers, people who can be given a set of information or a set of resources and then have to do something with them, right? That she's not interested in rote memorization of vocabulary words. She doesn't do like vocabulary building. She not in any explicit kind of way, right? That she does vocabulary building by introducing students to a variety of texts and resources and information that they can then glean vocabulary from, right? They're going to learn what suburbanization is by doing this project, in which they analyze what the main critiques of suburbanization are, and that's how they're going to learn that concept. So also a lot of time using technology in her classrooms, right? So the Genius Hour project was done almost exclusively in the computer lab. So every Friday, the class went to the computer lab and worked on their projects for the entire class period. And so they were in the kind of activities they were engaged in was research, right? So trying to figure out what is the pathway to becoming the professional pathway to becoming a hairstylist. And also trying to figure out what kind of presentation resources are available. So students were given, pretty much free range. They could build something. They could build a model. They could build a thing. They could do a physical demonstration. They could also do a technological presentation, right? So they were given options of using Prezis, PowerPoints. They could create videos. They could make digital stories. They could create a movie. They could just do a video or a picture slideshow. It really was it was their choice. And early on, they sort of had to advocate in individual one-on-one conferences with Ms. Kechuk. They had to advocate for what it was that they, for the media presentation or the presentation method they had chosen, and then they had to justify it, right? So why is that the most appropriate method for delivering this information? So those are the main materials. Let me think about this a little further. So in the social studies classroom, there were a lot of graphic organizers, right? I observed students writing a paper on fascist leadership, and so she had these handouts that she had given them that were just like paper planning. It was like a paper planning template, and it had some clip art on it, and it was really organized, and it was like, this was a space, it was like a house, right? So in the roof of the house is where they wrote the introduction, and then the body was like the main structure of the house, and then the conclusion was the front porch kind of thing. So she used worksheets such as that, templates such as that. Students made like information flood posters, right? So they studied a topic and then they created a poster where they had to represent the information that they absorbed through a variety of different reading resources in both in both textual and in both text and images. And so she just called those like information floods. So students were using markers and colored pencils to work on those projects. So a lot of different kinds of resources. Pretty free range when they were in the computer lab in terms of which technology, but I didn't see her using any of those additional technological resources that we talked about in class, like text-to-speech software, e-readers. I didn't see her using anything like that. Students weren't using iPads. I'm not sure if Buncombe County Schools has iPads. Perhaps there are some classrooms, but at least in my observations, I haven't seen any. And students, I think some students really on task. Some students, get this opportunity and to create something and really ran with it. And some other students were a lot more reluctant, 5, 6, 7 weeks into the project. And, some students hadn't really settled on what kind of presentation they were going to do, right? And so they're scrambling, in the last week or so before the presentations to throw together a PowerPoint. And they don't know where to get their images, and they don't know what to put on it, right? So she didn't use a whole lot of like graphic organizers or other kinds of like scaffolding materials to help the students plan the project, right? So she had these agendas for each week, and she had some instructions for what the product should be like, and she sort of continually reminded them, but she didn't provide them with a whole lot of resources to plan those projects in a more structured kind of way. So I guess, while I'm talking about that, that's probably one of the adaptations or accommodations that I would make. I would do a lot more explicit. I really loved observing the project-based learning in Ms. Keychuk's class. I would really like to find ways to incorporate that. A lot of the strategies and activities that I observed her use in my own classroom. One adaptation or accommodation I would likely make would be to have a lot more explicit and organized planning structure and materials available for students who need that extra support. And in my observations with Ms. Johnson, the inclusion specialist who works with Ms. Keychuk in her inclusive language arts class, Ms. Johnson, that was one of the complaints, if you will, about working with Ms. Keychuk and about Ms. Keychuk's pedagogical style, was that she felt as though Ms. Keychuk really relied on students being able to take advantage of the freedom that she was creating for them, and there were certain students for whom that level of freedom was actually really prohibitive for their learning. And so what Ms. Johnson ended up having to do was really step in some ways, and sort of create some of the infrastructure that she felt Ms. Keychuk's content design, course design was lacking. She also felt, Ms. Johnson also felt as though Ms. Keychuk relied too heavily on technology, and that for some of the lower income students, particularly her English language learning students, whose lives were very different from some of the native U.S., Western North Carolina born students' lives. So she said that she knows, firsthand, that a couple of her English language learners who also have IEPs, that these students, when school gets out at the end of the day, one of them goes to work with his uncle's landscaping business, and another student goes, I can't remember the exact example that she gave of where the other student went. But basically, these students weren't going home and using computer software. So technology was something, on the one hand, technology was really awesome, and using technology in the way that Ms. Keychuk was using it was really awesome, and it opened up a lot of learning opportunities. But for students who are not already proficient with that technology, they needed a lot more scaffolding and support to be able to use the technology in order to get to where they were going, right? So like doing a web quest was difficult. If a student didn't, like a web quest that required a student to have multiple browsers up, right? And so they have some of these executive functioning challenges, have difficulty switching back and forth between tasks and between different screens, and then writing a paper, right? So writing a paper on a computer screen while also sort of pulling information from different web documents and different browsers. That was a huge organizational challenge for some students with special needs. One of the greatest insights that I developed from observing Ms. Keychuk's classroom was that it's okay for the teacher to really take a back seat in her own classroom, and to trust the students to guide their own learning. You just sort of create the opportunity, right? You find the materials, and you give the students some kind of meaningful question or inquiry around which to consider those materials, and that they'll do the work. They'll do the learning. They will put in the effort, and that they will achieve what you hope for them to achieve. That you don't have to give them the information and the knowledge. That the students are going to develop the knowledge themselves by using the information that you help them find. Yeah, so that's my biggest insight. I will say a little bit more about observing Miss Keychick's classes when I also talk about my observations of Miss Johnson, the inclusion specialist who worked in Miss Keychick's class. But I think this is all that I have to say for now about Miss Keychick's general education courses.